G'day guys, Aussie Bloke here. So before we go any further, I'd just like to go over the basic format of these lessons. Basically, there's going to be no additional work required outside of these lessons. We're not going to be memorizing any complicated verb charts. We're not going to try to remember any phrases or anything like that. We're just going to be looking at the basic rules of the Spanish language and how they apply to the respective tenses that we'll be doing as the lessons unfold. So with regards to the content, basically what I'll be doing is slowly introducing the concepts and then going through an example relating to that concept. And then after that, I'll go through a few similar examples and I'll be asking for your input. The best way to get the most out of these lessons will be to pause the audio and try to answer the question asked out loud. And of course, if you're on a train or bus or something like that and can't do that, then just try and say the answer in your head. And then after that, I'll be revealing what the answer was. Now, these lessons will be getting progressively more difficult. So I would recommend that if there are any bits of the audio that you are having trouble with, that you go back and repeat those bits and try to get the answers as correct as you can before going on to the next one. And making mistakes will be completely normal and expected. Okay, let's get into it. So to start with, we'll just be looking at the present simple tense, and I'll just be focusing on the verbs that end in AR. If you remember on an earlier video, I mentioned that all verbs in Spanish end in either AR, ER, or IR. So we'll just be focusing on those that end in AR for now, although the rules for the present simple tense are pretty similar with the other types of verbs as well. So the first verb we'll be focusing on is the verb to speak, which in Spanish is hablar, Hablar, hablar. So if you want to take the to form of the verb and transform that into the I form of the verb, what you're going to do is push down on the second last syllable of the verb, and the AR is going to drop off the end and will be replaced with an O. So what do I mean by this? So the to form of the verb again is hablar, and if you wanted to say I speak, that would become hablo, 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 hablo. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the verb to need, which in Spanish is necesitar. So if you do the same thing that we did with hablar and you push down on the second last syllable and replace the AR at the end with an O, that would become necesito, I need, necesito. And if we now look at the verb to take, which in Spanish is tomar, how do you think you would say I take? Tomo, tomo, T-O-M-O. And if we now look at the verb aceptar, how do you think you'd say I accept? Acepto, acepto. Now let's say instead of wanting to use the I form of the verb, you wanted to use the he, she, or it form of the verb. The rule is really similar, and instead of dropping the AR at the end and replacing it with an O, basically the R just drops off the end, and you're still going to be pushing down on the second last syllable. So for example, with hablar, if you wanted to say he, she, or it speaks, that just becomes habla, habla. And with the verb necesitar, if you wanted to say he, she, or it needs, that would become necesita, necesita. And if we consider the verb to take, tomar, if you wanted to say he, she, or it takes, how do you think you would say it? Toma, toma. And if you wanted to take the verb aceptar, how do you think you would say he, she, or it accepts? Acepta, acepta. Now let's consider the you form of the verb. So basically what I mean is just that if you're speaking with someone one-on-one and you want to say that they do that verb, what you're going to do is just replace the R at the end of the to form of the verb and replace that with an S. So if you consider hablar, again for example, if you wanted to say you speak, that just becomes hablas, hablas. And just a quick note with the you form of the verb, it's sometimes taught that this is a bit more informal, and that you'd only use this version with friends and that sort of thing. But in my experience, you can basically use this with anyone, and the only time I would really avoid using the you form of the verb is maybe in a very formal scenario, like a job interview or something like that. So yeah, I'd be very confident using this with pretty much anyone you're speaking to one-on-one. So now if we look at the verb necesitar, if you wanted to say you need, that would become necesitas, necesitas. And if we go back again to the verb tomar, to take, how do you think you would say you take? Tomas, tomas. And likewise with the verb aceptar, to accept, how do you think you would say you accept? Aceptas, aceptas. Now let's consider the they form of the verb, and that behaves in a very similar way to the you form of the verb, but instead of replacing the R at the end of the verb with an S, we're going to replace it with an N. So if we again look at the verb to speak, hablar, if you wanted to say they speak, that would become hablan, hablan. Or if we look at the verb necesitar, to need, if you wanted to say they need, that becomes necesitan, necesitan. And now if we look at the verb tomar, to take, how do you think you would say they take? Toman, toman. And again, if we look at the verb aceptar, to accept, how do you think you would say they accept? Aceptan, aceptan. That's pretty much it for the present simple tense with verbs ending in AR. I know we didn't cover the we form of the verb. That is a little bit different, and we'll be going over that on the next episode. And there's one other thing that I forgot to mention before. This rule does hold strong for the vast majority of verbs ending in AR, but there are a few exceptions to those, and we'll be learning the most common ones at a later stage. So that's it for this one, guys. Hope someone out there learned something, and we'll see you on the next one.